Eric had never been the type to get involved in other people's relationships. It wasn't his business, and he had always believed that unless someone was directly hurting him, it was best to stay out of it. But that was before he moved to a new city, before he saw something that made his stomach twist with unease, before he found himself in a position where silence felt just as much like a betrayal as the act itself. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, it really helps, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss. When he first arrived in town, he felt isolated. Everything was unfamiliar: the streets, the people, the atmosphere. The only comforting connection he had was Samantha, the longtime girlfriend of his closest friend, Dan. Knowing she lived here made things a little easier. They weren't exactly close, but she was a familiar face, and for someone trying to find his footing in a new place, she had even been friendly enough to invite him out a few times, introducing him to some of her friends. It made settling in a little smoother, though he never spent much time with her outside of those casual meetups. Then came that night. He had no intention of running into her, and certainly no intention of seeing what he saw. It was a regular Saturday, and after a long week at work, Eric decided to head to one of the popular bars downtown. It wasn't his usual scene, but he figured a drink and some music might help shake off the weight of his solitude. He had just ordered a beer when he spotted her across the room. At first, he didn't think much of it. She had every right to be there, of course. But as he watched her for a few moments, something about the way she moved, the way she interacted with the people around her, made his grip on his glass tighten. Samantha wasn't just out with friends. She was pressed up against a man who was definitely not Dan. She laughed at something he whispered in her ear, her fingers lightly grazing his chest as she leaned into him. It wasn't a brief, meaningless touch. It lingered, intimate in a way that made Eric uncomfortable just witnessing it. A few moments later, another man approached, and instead of backing away, she welcomed him, resting a hand on his arm, tilting her head in that flirtatious way that spoke of familiarity. Eric tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was nothing, maybe she was just naturally affectionate. But then he saw it, the moment that removed all doubt. One of the men wrapped his hands around her waist, fingers digging in possessively as he whispered something in her ear. She didn't push him away. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she turned to face him, her hands sliding up his arms, and before Eric could process what was happening, they kissed. The sight made his stomach drop. He had been friends with Dan for years, had seen the way he looked at Samantha, the way he talked about her as if she were the best thing in his life, and now here she was, in plain sight, betraying him without hesitation. Eric wanted to believe there was an explanation, but deep down, he knew there wasn't. He turned away, staring down at his drink, his thoughts a mess. What was he supposed to do with this? Pretend he hadn't seen it? Confront her? Call Dan right then and there? He didn't know. What he did know was that if Dan ever found out and realized Eric had seen it and said nothing, it would destroy their friendship. But if he told him, he would be the one shattering Dan's world. Eric stayed at the bar longer than he intended, watching from a distance as Samantha continued to dance, laugh, touch, and kiss another man as if she had no worries in the world. She didn't even bother being discreet. That was what shocked him the most. She wasn't sneaking around. She was acting as if Dan didn't even exist. When he finally left, the cold air outside did little to clear his head. His hands were in his pockets, his jaw clenched tight. He had always prided himself on staying out of other people's drama, but this wasn't just anyone. This was Dan. And no matter which way he looked at it, he couldn't shake the feeling that doing nothing would be just as much a betrayal as what Samantha had done that night. Eric barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Samantha in that bar resurfaced. Her laughing, touching, kissing a man who was not Dan. He replayed it over and over, trying to find a way to convince himself that maybe, just maybe, it hadn't been what it so clearly was. He wanted to believe there was some other explanation, something that would make this whole situation disappear, but deep down, he knew the truth. No matter how many different angles he looked at it from, no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the fact remained the same. She had cheated, and he had seen it with his own eyes. The weight of that realization sat heavy in his chest. What was he supposed to do with it? Telling Dan seemed like the right thing to do, but at the same time it felt like the worst possible thing. He could already picture the look on Dan's face, the initial confusion, the disbelief, the desperate hope that Eric was mistaken. And then, once it all sank in, the heartbreak. Dan wasn't just in love with Samantha, he was all in. He had talked about proposing. He had told Eric more than once that she was the one. And now Eric would be the one to take that away from him. But what was the alternative? Staying quiet? Pretending he hadn't seen it? Letting Dan go on thinking everything was fine while Samantha made a fool out of him? The very thought of it made Eric's stomach churn. It wasn't just the act of cheating that made him feel sick. It was the way Samantha had done it, so effortlessly, so carelessly, as if it were nothing. She hadn't even bothered to be discreet. She had done it right out in the open, in a place where anyone could have seen her. That meant one of two things. Either she didn't care if she got caught, or she was so confident that Dan would never suspect her that she didn't think she needed to be careful. Neither option made Eric feel any better. If she had done this so brazenly, how many times had she done it before? How many nights had Dan been at home trusting her while she was out doing this exact same thing? How many people knew about it? Were there others, like Eric, who had seen and chosen to stay quiet? He sat alone in his apartment, the only light coming from the glow of his phone screen. His mind was racing, and no matter how hard he tried to push his thoughts away, they kept circling back to the same question. What was he supposed to do? He opened up Dan's contact on his phone and stared at it for a long time, his thumb hovering over the call button, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. Not yet. He needed more proof, more certainty, something that would leave no room for doubt. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe he had misread the situation. Maybe this wasn't what it looked like. But as much as he wanted to believe that, he knew it wasn't true. The way Samantha had touched that guy, the way she had kissed him, it wasn't some drunken mistake or a misunderstanding. It was intentional. It was real. With a heavy sigh, Eric did what he never thought he would do. He started looking. He pulled up Samantha's social media, scrolling through her posts, looking for any sign, any clue, anything that might confirm or contradict what he had seen. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Her profile was full of carefully curated pictures, her and Dan smiling at a restaurant, her hand in his at a beachside resort, a candid shot of them laughing together at a party. To anyone else, they looked like the perfect couple, but to Eric, knowing what he knew now, it all felt fake. Then he saw it. A comment on one of her recent pictures. Just a simple inside joke followed by a winking emoji. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing that would raise suspicion to an outsider, but the guy who had left it was the same one she had kissed at the bar. Eric's stomach twisted. He clicked on the guy's profile, scrolling through his pictures. There was nothing incriminating, nothing that directly tied him to Samantha, but Eric had seen enough. He knew what he had witnessed, and now he had even more reason to believe that it wasn't a one-time thing. That was when he realized he couldn't ignore this. He couldn't keep quiet. Dan deserved to know the truth, and if he ever found out later, if he realized that Eric had known all along and said nothing, it would be even worse. Keeping it from him wasn't protecting him. It was letting him live in a lie. Eric set his phone down, rubbing his hands over his face. This wasn't going to be easy. There was no way to soften it, no way to make it hurt less. But some things had to be done, no matter how much they hurt. He took a deep breath, picked up his phone again, and pulled up Dan's number. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest. Once he made this call, there would be no going back. With one last exhale, he pressed the button. Eric held the phone to his ear, his pulse hammering in his throat as it rang. A part of him hoped Dan wouldn't pick up, that the universe would grant him a moment of mercy, allowing him to avoid being the bearer of news that would rip his friend's world apart. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. After the third ring, Dan's familiar voice came through the line, light-hearted, oblivious. "Hey man, what's up?" Eric swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. "Hey, you got a minute? There's something I need to talk to you about." There was a brief pause before Dan answered, "Yeah, sure. Everything okay?" "No," Eric wanted to say. Nothing about this was okay. But how did he even begin? How did he take everything he had seen last night and put it into words that wouldn't completely destroy his best friend? There was no way to soften it, no way to make it less painful. Still, he had to try. "Listen," Eric said, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't really know how to say this, so I'm just going to be straight with you. It's about Samantha." The silence on the other end stretched for a moment, just long enough for Eric to hear the subtle shift in Dan's breathing. "What about her?" Eric closed his eyes, bracing himself. "I saw her last night, at the bar downtown. She wasn't alone." Dan didn't respond right away. When he finally did, his voice was guarded. "Okay, he was with someone," Eric continued, forcing the words out before he could lose his nerve. "Not just with someone. She was all over him, laughing, touching, kissing. And it wasn't just some drunken mistake. It was like it wasn't the first time." A heavy silence followed. Eric waited, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles ached. Dan wasn't saying anything, and that made everything worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dan let out a sharp breath, one that sounded more like a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You sure about this?" His voice was tight, strained, like he was barely holding something back. "I wouldn't be telling you if I wasn't." Another long pause. Then Dan spoke again, his tone colder now. "You actually saw her? You're not just telling me something you heard?" "I saw it with my own eyes, Dan." The weight of those words hung in the air. Eric could hear the subtle shift in Dan's breathing, the way it had become slower, more controlled, as if he were trying to keep himself from reacting too quickly. Then came a sound. Something soft, like Dan had run a hand over his face, exhaling through his nose. "I knew something was off," Dan finally muttered. Eric frowned, shifting in his chair. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Just little things," Dan admitted. "She's been acting weird lately, secretive, always on her phone, canceling plans, and I guess I just told myself I was imagining it because..." He cut himself off abruptly, exhaling sharply. "Because I didn't want to believe it." Eric felt a deep pang of guilt, not because he had told Dan, but because his friend sounded like he was already breaking apart, trying to piece together moments he had ignored, red flags he had brushed aside. He probably felt like an idiot, and Eric hated that Samantha had put him in this position. "I'm sorry, man," Eric said quietly. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but I couldn't just keep this to myself." Dan let out a slow breath. "I know," he said after a moment. "I appreciate it. Really, I need to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do now." Eric hesitated before speaking again. "Do you want proof?" Dan went silent. Then cautiously, "What do you mean?" "I took pictures," Eric admitted, feeling his stomach twist at the confession. "I didn't know if I should, but I had this feeling that you might not believe me unless you saw it yourself." For a moment, there was nothing but quiet between them. Then Dan let out a bitter laugh, low, humorless. "Yeah, send them." Eric swallowed hard, unlocking his phone. He pulled up his camera roll, selecting the clearest shots before pressing send. He waited, listening to the faint sound of Dan's phone vibrating, followed by nothing but silence. 1 minute passed. Then another. Eric didn't dare speak. He could only imagine what Dan was thinking as he stared at the photos, undeniable proof that the woman he loved, the woman he had thought he would spend the rest of his life with, had been lying to him all along. Finally, Dan spoke again, his voice eerily calm. "Well, that confirms it." Eric shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what you want to do, but whatever it is, I've got your back." Dan let out another quiet laugh, but this time there was something different about it. A hardness, a sharpness. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm going to do." Eric frowned at the sudden steel in his friend's voice. "Dan, she thinks she can play me for a fool. Dan said, his tone dropping to something cold, something dangerous. She thinks she can do this and get away with it, but she has no idea who she's messing with. Eric's chest tightened. He had expected devastation, heartbreak. He had expected Dan to sound broken, lost, but what he was hearing now was something else entirely. Dan wasn't just going to end things. He was going to make sure Samantha regretted every second of what she had done. Dan didn't waste time. The moment he ended the call with Eric, he started planning. He wasn't the type to react impulsively, to throw a fit or lash out without thinking. No, if Samantha thought she could make a fool of him, she was about to learn how wrong she was. He wasn't going to just break up with her. He wasn't going to yell or beg for an explanation. He was going to make sure she felt the weight of every single lie, every betrayal. And when it was over, she would be the one drowning in humiliation, not him. The first step was simple. He told Samantha he had to leave town for work, a last-minute business trip that would have him gone for the weekend. She didn't question it. Why would she? She had long since assumed he was clueless. If she had even the slightest suspicion that Dan knew the truth, she wouldn't have smiled so sweetly when he kissed her goodbye. She wouldn't have texted him later that night, saying how much she missed him, while Eric watched her drape herself over another man at the same bar. Eric sent updates throughout the night, confirming what Dan already knew. She wasn't loyal, not even when she thought he was miles away. She was bold, laughing in the arms of someone else as if she didn't have a boyfriend waiting for her. Dan read the messages without feeling. The shock had passed. Now there was only the cold satisfaction of knowing her downfall was near. The real plan went into motion the next day. Dan reached out to a few people he knew Samantha cared about. Her best friends, her colleagues, even her parents. He made sure they were all available that evening. He invited them under the pretense of a surprise dinner for Samantha, a celebration of their anniversary. Samantha, of course, had no idea. She thought she was getting away with everything. The restaurant was one of her favorites. Upscale, elegant, the kind of place where people dressed well and appearances mattered. Dan arrived early, setting everything up. He had spent the morning compiling everything Eric had gathered. Photos, messages, videos. It was all there, undeniable evidence of her infidelity. But rather than confronting her in private, he had a different stage in mind. If she had been shameless enough to betray him so openly, then he had no reason to spare her dignity. By the time Samantha arrived, everyone was already seated, waiting. She walked in, unsuspecting, dressed beautifully, with that same confident smile on her face. Dan stood to greet her, pulling out her chair like the perfect boyfriend. He watched her scan the table, her expression flickering with surprise when she realized who was there. "My parents," she whispered, leaning in toward him. "And why is my boss here?" Dan smiled, the same way she had smiled at him so many times before. "It's a special night," he said smoothly. "I wanted everyone important to you to be here." She seemed pleased with the idea, sitting down and chatting lightly with those around her, oblivious to the fact that the walls were closing in. Dan let her enjoy it for a few minutes. Let her believe, just for a little while longer, that she had won. Then, once the drinks were served and everyone had settled in, he tapped his glass lightly with a spoon, drawing attention. "I just want to take a moment to say how much I appreciate everyone being here tonight," he began, his voice even. "This is an important evening for me and Samantha. We've been together for 3 years now, and I thought it was time to celebrate everything we've built together. The trust, the loyalty." He paused, letting those words sink in. Across the table, Eric watched, silent, knowing exactly where this was going. Samantha beamed at him, no doubt assuming he was about to propose. Dan almost laughed at the thought. "I wanted to make tonight even more special by sharing a little something I put together," he continued, reaching for his phone. "A small look at what our relationship has meant to me." The projector screen behind them flickered to life. A few people clapped, expecting a sweet montage of memories, and for the first few seconds, that's exactly what it was. Pictures of them together, vacations, birthdays, moments filled with love. But then the images began to change. The next picture was of Samantha at the bar, laughing as a stranger wrapped an arm around her. The next was even worse, her lips pressed against another man's, her hands gripping his shirt. The restaurant fell silent. Samantha's smile froze on her face, her body going stiff. A murmur spread through the table, confusion turning into quiet horror. Someone gasped. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth. The images kept coming, one after another, until finally a short video clip played. Samantha whispering something in the ear of the man she had kissed. Then, clear as day, her voice came through the speakers. Dan will never find out. Silence. Samantha pushed back from the table, her face drained of all color. Dan, He didn't give her the chance. No, don't even try, he said, his voice calm but cold. You lied to me. You lied to everyone at this table, and you did it with such confidence, as if I'd never figure it out. He turned to the stunned faces around them. I thought everyone here should see who she really is. Not the perfect girlfriend she pretends to be, but the woman who looked me in the eye every day while sneaking around behind my back. Samantha's father was glaring at her. Her mother looked like she might cry, and her boss, her professional, well-respected boss, sat stiffly, already looking uncomfortable with the scandal playing out before him. Samantha's reputation was unraveling right in front of her. She tried again. Dan, please, this isn't what it looks like. I was drunk, No, he cut her off. You were drunk every time? Because Eric saw you last night. I saw the proof myself. And even if that weren't enough, you said it yourself. He gestured to the screen, which was still frozen on the image of her lips against another man's. You thought I'd never find out. She turned toward Eric, her face twisting in anger now. You followed me? Eric didn't flinch. I saw you, and I wasn't the only one. She looked around, realizing how many pairs of eyes were locked onto her with judgment, disappointment, disgust. There was no way out of this. Dan had made sure of that. He stood up, pushing his chair back. You can stay and explain yourself if you want, but I'm done. He glanced at the others. Enjoy the dinner, it's already paid for. With that, he walked away, leaving Samantha standing there, humiliated, her betrayal laid bare for all to see. Eric followed a few seconds later, catching up to him outside. Dan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. That felt good? Eric smirked. I bet. Dan looked back at the restaurant one last time, shaking his head. Let's get a drink. A real one. Eric clapped a hand on his shoulder. First round's on me. As they walked down the street, the weight of betrayal lifted from Dan's shoulders, replaced with something far better, vindication. Samantha stood frozen in place, her face drained of all color. The restaurant was silent, the weight of what had just unfolded settling over the room like a suffocating blanket. People exchanged awkward glances, unsure of whether to speak or pretend they hadn't just witnessed the complete and utter dismantling of her carefully constructed image. The slideshow on the screen was still paused on the damning picture of her wrapped around another man, and there was no way to escape it. Her parents sat stiffly at the table, her father glaring at her with quiet fury, while her mother looked too shocked to form words. Her boss had leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable, though the slight downturn of his lips spoke volumes. She turned sharply toward Eric, her voice laced with venom. You set me up, she hissed, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. Eric didn't flinch. I didn't set you up, Samantha. I saw you. I saw what you did. And so did everyone else. She turned back toward Dan, desperate now, her voice shifting into something softer, more pleading. Dan, please. You have to let me explain. Dan had been watching her with an unreadable expression, but at her words he let out a quiet laugh. Low, humorless, devoid of any emotion. He leaned back against his chair, arms crossed over his chest, as if she were nothing more than a stranger trying to sell him a lie. Explain? He echoed, shaking his head. Explain what, exactly? That you weren't cheating on me despite the pictures? That this was just some misunderstanding? His voice was calm, eerily controlled. Because I think we all just heard you say, Dan will never find out. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. There was no defense against the truth, no way to spin the images flashing on that screen into something innocent. "You did this to yourself, Samantha," Dan continued, his voice never rising, never wavering. "You chose to lie. You chose to betray me. And the worst part? You thought I was so blind, so stupid, that I'd never catch on." He let out another soft chuckle, shaking his head. "I wonder how many times you laughed at me behind my back." She shook her head quickly, her eyes welling with tears. "No, Dan, it wasn't like that. It didn't mean anything. I was drunk and it got out of hand." Dan's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked bored. "Right," he said flatly. "So, it didn't mean anything, and I'm supposed to believe that? The guy you were kissing last night? The same one commenting on your pictures? The same one I saw you touching like I didn't exist? That was all just a mistake?" He tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Or were all the other nights mistakes too?" Her breath hitched and her eyes darted around the table, as if searching for someone to defend her, but no one spoke. No one would. Samantha had always been good at controlling the narrative, always been able to charm her way out of trouble, but this was something else entirely. She wasn't just exposed, she was exposed in front of everyone who mattered to her. Her father, who had always been so proud of the way she carried herself, now looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear. Her mother, who had once gushed about how lucky she was to have Dan, now looked at her with deep, disappointed sadness. Her boss, the man she had worked so hard to impress, the one she had been hoping would recommend her for a promotion, sat with his hands folded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Dan," she tried again, her voice breaking now. "Please, can we talk about this in private?" Dan exhaled slowly, then stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves as he did. He stared at her for a long moment, as if truly seeing her for the first time. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "There's nothing left to talk about." With that, he turned and walked away from the table. The weight of finality in those words hit her harder than any screaming match ever could have. Samantha shot up from her seat, stumbling slightly as she tried to follow him. "Dan, wait!" He didn't stop. Eric stood as well, throwing a few bills onto the table for his drink before turning to Samantha one last time. "You really thought you'd never get caught, didn't you?" His voice wasn't cruel, just filled with something close to pity. "Guess you were wrong." And then he followed Dan out the door. Samantha stood there, breathless, shaking, with everyone's eyes still on her. She wanted to scream, wanted to make them understand that she wasn't the villain they were painting her out to be. But there was no saving this moment, no coming back from it. Her reputation, her relationship, everything, gone in a matter of minutes. Her father was the first to stand. Without a word, he reached into his wallet, pulled out some cash for the check, and set it down on the table. Then he turned to his daughter, his voice clipped. "We'll talk later." "Ah! Ah!" Her mother avoided her eyes entirely as she followed him out. One by one, the rest of the guests quietly excused themselves, leaving Samantha standing alone in the middle of the restaurant, surrounded by nothing but the remnants of her own destruction. Dan walked out of the restaurant without looking back. The night air was crisp, a stark contrast to the heat of the confrontation that had just unfolded. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. For months he had been living a lie, believing in a love that had never truly existed. Now, it was over. The betrayal, the deceit, the fake smiles, it was all behind him. Samantha had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. Eric caught up to him a few steps later, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You okay?" Dan let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know, I thought I'd feel worse, but honestly, I just feel done." He exhaled sharply. "I wasted 3 years on her. 3 years thinking she was my future." He turned to Eric, his expression unreadable. "How did I not see it?" Eric shrugged. "Because you loved her. And when you love someone, you don't look for reasons to doubt them." Dan nodded slowly. It made sense. Love had blinded him, made him ignore the signs, made him trust someone who had never deserved it. But love wasn't enough. not when trust had been shattered beyond repair. He pulled out his phone and opened Samantha's contact. He stared at it for a second, then pressed block. The action felt strangely final, like closing a book that had already gone on too long. "You're really done, huh?" Eric asked, watching him. Dan slipped his phone back into his pocket. More than done, but Samantha wasn't. By the time Dan got home, there were already missed calls, text messages. She had left the restaurant humiliated, but she wasn't the type to go down quietly. The messages started with apologies, desperate pleas to talk. "Dan, I swear it didn't mean anything. Please, you have to believe me." Then came excuses. "I was drunk. I wasn't thinking." Then anger. "I can't believe you embarrassed me like that. That was low, even for you." And finally, threats. "If you don't answer me, I will show up at your place. You owe me at least a conversation." He didn't owe her anything. Eric had stayed over, sensing that Samantha might try something reckless. And sure enough, a little after midnight, there was a knock at the door. Then another. Then a louder one. Dan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Unbelievable." Eric leaned back on the couch. "You want me to handle it?" Dan shook his head. "No, I'll do it." He walked to the door and opened it, coming face to face with Samantha. She looked nothing like the confident woman who had walked into that restaurant earlier. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, and her eyes were wide with desperation. "Dan, please," she breathed. "Just let me talk." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Talk? You mean lie? Like you've been doing for who knows how long?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I swear I'll tell you everything. I don't want to lose you." Dan let out a cold laugh. "You lost me the second you decided another guy's lips were worth the risk." He gestured toward the street. "Go home, Samantha. There's nothing left to say." Her hands clenched into fists. "You think you can just humiliate me and walk away?" Her voice rose, her composure slipping. "You think people are going to take your side after that stunt?" Dan's expression didn't change. "I don't care what people think. I cared about you, and you threw it away." He tilted his head slightly. "That's the difference between us. I never had anything to hide." Her face twisted in frustration. "You can't just erase me from your life, Dan. We've been together for 3 years. That doesn't just go away overnight." He nodded. "You're right, it doesn't." He paused, letting the silence stretch between them. Then he exhaled, his tone final. "But it does end." She stared at him, waiting, hoping for something. Maybe a sign of regret, maybe an opening to manipulate her way back in. But there was nothing, just quiet certainty. Finally, she took a step back. "You'll regret this." Dan's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No, I really won't." She hesitated for one last second, then turned and walked away. When Dan closed the door, Eric raised an eyebrow from the couch. "That was a hell of a breakup speech." Dan chuckled, shaking his head as he sank into the chair. "I meant every word." Eric lifted his beer in a mock toast. "To dodging a bullet." Dan clinked his bottle against Eric's and took a sip. The weight that had been pressing down on him for weeks, months, maybe even years, was gone. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. Samantha had thought she could betray him without consequence, that she could keep up the act indefinitely, but in the end, she had been wrong. And Dan? He was finally moving on.